الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على حي على حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله. سبحانك يا رب. رب العزة عما يصفون. سبحانك. وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على عظيمنا وشفيع نفوسنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وأصحابه القر الميامين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد، قال النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم: أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها. وأيضا قال: إني تارك فيكم الثقلين كتاب الله وعترة أهل بيتي. In the months of June through August, June, July, and August, we saw the rise and we saw the demise of a surprising number of world leaders. In the United States, we saw the sudden political death of Joe Biden and the birth of Kamala Harris. In Iran, we saw the surprising voice of hope in the personality of Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, who replaced the previous president, Raisi. In Palestine, we witnessed the martyrdom of Ismail Haniyeh. And now we bear witness to the consolidation of leadership in the person of Yahya Sinwar. In Bangladesh, we watched and observed the ousting of Sheikh Hasina and the brave stand of the Bangladeshi people that was led by their courageous students. These are but a few examples. There are probably even more. But I want to focus on what is dubbed now the second Bangladeshi revolution, the tipping point of which came through the quota reform movement. These protests began in June 4th, or June 4th is what set off the protests, by the Supreme Court of Bangladesh when they upheld and reinstated a 30% quota for the descendants of the freedom fighters. The quote-unquote freedom fighters are known in Bangladesh and are praised and are beloved as they were the ones who fought for independence from Pakistan in 1971. A very bloody and difficult conflict. Then June 7th through June 30th saw protests in Bangladesh that spread across the country and included police clashing violently with protesters. On the 1st of July, university students initiated blockades of roads and railways. And on July 14th, the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, who has been a Prime Minister for 5 terms, the last 4 terms in a row, since 2009, that's 15 years. She uttered an unforgivable statement in response to the protests. During a news conference, she was asked about the protests against the job quotas. She dismissed the protesters with the remark, "If the grandchildren of freedom fighters don't receive quota benefits, who will? The grandchildren of Razakars?" Razakar is, of course, it means volunteer. Rida kar, kar in Persian, and Raza or Raza is seeking to volunteer or to do goodness, like khairi, to do good, volunteer, seeking the pleasure of Allah, essentially. But razakar is a very pejorative and offensive term in Bangladesh because it refers specifically to a class of people that supported the Pakistani military's attempt to suppress the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, and they stand accused of truly horrific crimes. So razakar is possibly the worst thing you can call someone in Bangladesh, especially in the political arena. In the following 5 days, over 200 people were killed by the state. Hasina did not condemn the violence. Instead, she bemoaned the damage to government property. At this point, the protest became about ousting a tyrant. This tyrant who has engaged in suppression of rival political parties, voter suppression, nepotism, hundreds of forced disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, the list goes on, over a 15-year period. Naturally, this outrage carried internationally, and Bangladeshis living abroad also took to the streets. One such place was in the United Arab Emirates, which has a significant Bengali population. Witnessing the mass killing and the brutal injuries inflicted on the people of Bangladesh and the arrests, Bengalis in the UAE hit the streets and they protested. They protested the regime of Sheikh Hasina. Well, they were arrested, and on July 22nd, a court in the UAE jailed 57 Bangladeshi nationals for staging these protests. 53 of them were sentenced to 10 years in prison for engaging in these protests in the UAE. One was for 11 years, and 3 were sentenced to life in prison in the Emirates for protesting what was going on in their home country. Think about how committed the United Arab Emirates is to protecting fascism and tyranny worldwide, that they would simply uninvited, unsolicited, assume to do the bidding of a tyrant who, it cannot be neglected to mention, has very close ties to the BJP and Modi of India. And of course, we know the relationship between the Emirates and Modi and India. The violence, of course, continued to grow worse in late July. On the 4th of August, government supporters and police clashed with thousands of students who had began their march on Dhaka. Hundreds, perhaps even over 1,000 people have been killed. The numbers are not clear. The following day, Hasina was overwhelmed and lost the support and the protection of the military. She fled to India. And on the 8th of August, which was yesterday, a Nobel Prize laureate named Muhammad Yunus was sworn in as an interim leader of Bangladesh. A decent man who spent his life in service of the poor and the needy. About 5 days ago, a Bangladeshi supporter of the Usuli Institute posted a comment on the khutbah that we last broadcasted before our hiatus in June. Sayyidah Nargis asks, would the Usuli Institute arrange a khutbah regarding Bangladesh? I'm a civil service candidate in Bangladesh. I want to know from the professor who, if I was being my best self, whose intention it is to please Allah in the best possible way, would it be possible to do so as a diplomat or an administrator? Sincerely waiting for your answer. Thank you. Very tough question, and a very tough moment for the Bangladeshi people. My heart goes out to them, and I followed the difficult developments very closely, and I was saddened to see that there wasn't a lot of support, and virtually no one spoke about these 54 people who were arrested and sentenced to unbelievable prison terms in the UAE. But they succeeded. And revolutions come at a very, very high cost and sacrifice. But let us see if we can try to help answer the question of our supporter as she navigates this new reality in Bangladesh by reviewing a sermon from Imam Ali, whom, as I stated in the beginning, was described by the Prophet when he said that I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. This hadith, of course, is used or is often referred to in many different settings, depending on whether you're Sunni or Shi'i or Sunni Sufi. But it is not limited to simply the spiritual realm. It is far beyond that. That gate to the door, that gate to the city of knowledge, is something that can be observed and proved through a close inspection of his sermons and his thought. And we would be remiss to ignore this sermon at this present stage. Recently, Professor Tahira Qutbuddin published a very good translation of Nahj al-Balagha, which of course contains the sermons of Imam Ali. And I think she's done a really wonderful job. I'm of course a student, but nonetheless, I have benefited greatly from her new translation. And there are certain parts of the translation where I don't necessarily disagree, but I'm going to offer just a little bit of commentary to think about what this sermon is saying in a cohesive whole, and to see if certain aspects of the language can be explained or tweaked or offer a alternative definition at certain points, so that we can understand the spirit of the sermon a little bit better. The sermon begins, and I'll read it in English and avoid Arabic as much as possible, but sometimes it will be necessary. The speech begins with the following. God has given me the right and the duty, haqqan, over you to govern your affairs, and has given you rights over me, similar to those which I have over you. Rights are the broadest of things in their description and the narrowest in equitable application. They are never credited to any individual except that they can also be credited against him. I would say they never flow towards any individual except that they can also flow against him. And they are likewise never credited against him except that they can also be credited to him. If it were possible for any being to have rights credited to but not against him, that position would be reserved for the Almighty God alone. It would not apply to any of his creatures because he is all-powerful over his servants and always just in enacting his decrees. But God made it his right over his servants that they obey him, while also making it incumbent upon himself to recompense them with manifold reward through the abundant generosity and expansive bounty only he can bestow. Let us pause here in the sermon. It's a sermon that is meticulous both in style and structure. And there are many recurring words and usages of the word haqq in this sermon. I believe it's purposeful on Imam Ali's part to use haqq in these varying ways. And after you read the sermon several times, you start to wonder whether haqq means a right or duty. And I think it's part of the point of the sermon. So he begins by balancing the powerful and esteemed position of being a governor of Muslim affairs, or people's affairs in general, that the government acknowledge the rights of the citizenry over the governor, and likewise the citizenry recognize the right of the governor over them. This is an unbelievable closing of the gap in power dynamics far ahead of its time. You need only look at those who came into power, like the Umayyads, immediately after the governance of Imam Ali. There was no such principle that was even close to being applied. Not for several generations, at least. So Ali underscores the concept of balance. What kind of balance? When it comes to rights, one does not enjoy a right without also being accountable for that right in the form of a duty. But if one can enjoy the benefit of the right, they must also be prepared to have that same right apply against them. Ali uses the word jara. This is what Professor Qutb tried to translate as credited. But jara has a meaning that is closer to flow, like in the Quran, for example. When we talk about the rivers that flow in Jannah, they yajri. This is the same word. And I think it's important to think about the word usage. And I thought of course, rivers when I think of flowing. And if you think about a river, the way that a river works is that it begins at a source. That source could be a glacier, or it could be a lake, or it could be any number of places where there's a initial source. A stream comes out of that source, and it flows downhill. And then rainwater and different tributaries will feed into that stream, making a river system. And that river system will grow in its current, and it will continue to pour downstream. Ultimately, it will also have exit points, and it will empty into a river mouth. And there's a watershed there where the river empties into another body of water. This is an amazing type of imagery that's very subtly used. It's not that Imam Ali is meaning to come and draw a very specific equation where he equates the flowing of rights to the anatomy and physiology of a river. But it does invoke an image of responsibility and an image of the way that things flow. If you take an entitlement and it carries you downstream, if you are not careful, in order to go back upstream towards the source, you will have to go against the current. You have to be very responsible with the way you travel on this river. But after he talks about this dynamic of rights and duties and how they flow to and from each other and against each other, the following sentence is very key, in which he talks about the only entity in which rights are owed to him, but not necessarily the other way around, is God. And that's because he's ever just. And furthermore, it's because he has assigned and obligated upon himself kindness and mercy upon his creation. Infallible human beings will never be able to take that position. And any attempt to do so would be a usurpation of God's sovereignty and would, in my opinion, amount to shirk. It cannot be done. Corruption flows from this source or from this deviation. So, therefore, according to Ali, the power dynamics between the governor and the governed must be intricately balanced. It's not too difficult to understand. The next part of the sermon, he says, then, as a part of God's own rights, he mandated rights for some people over others. He balanced or made equal these rights in their various aspects, making some entail others, I would say necessitate, and some not to be necessitated or not to be entailed except by others. The greatest of his mandated rights are those of the ruler over his subjects and those of the subjects over their ruler. This is a duty that God has mandated for everyone over everyone in a system that generates mutual regard and strengthens their deen. For subjects will not be righteous except when their ruler is righteous, and a ruler will not be righteous except when his subjects are steadfast. Again, a number of points here that we need to think about and that I will suggest in terms of translation. He balanced these rights. Yes, tatakafa'u. Tatakafa'u means to make equal. Entail. Yujib or yujibu. Necessitates, I think, is a closer one. So God makes equal these rights in various aspects, and making some rights necessitate other rights, and some rights not be necessary except by others. Then he says that the greatest right, a'adhamu is the word that he uses, the greatest right in this dynamic of rights that flows from God to the human being is then the genus of rights that flow between people, right? The greatest right in that genus is the governed over the governor and vice versa. What he says is that God originally obligated this mandate and that the right was systematized. This dynamic of leader or governor and citizenry and vice versa was systematized for a mutual regard, or what I would say familiarity, li'ulifatihim, and to strengthen what the professor calls Islam, but it's lidinihim. I would call that accountability. So logically, the maintenance of this systematization is then assigned to humankind. Whether it begins with God creating this dynamic, or whether it begins with human beings needing to create a nizam, it begins, or rather the responsibility lands with us. فريضة فرضها الله سبحانه لكل على كل فجعلها هذا حق فجعلها نظاما لألفتهم وعزا لدينهم. If we now think about, place into the center of your mind this great haqq. Allah says, or Ali says that Allah created rights, and of these rights are the rights that flow between human beings. And the rights that flow between human beings, the most greatest right of them is the right of the ruler towards the governed and the governed back towards the governor in an equal correspondence. Equal. Similar. He's made that فَجَعَلَهُ نِظَامًا لِأُلْفَتِهِمْ. Ulfa is a word that is probably closest defined to familiarity. Or ilf means a type of loving, friendly kindness that exists between people or anything. That is the type of ilf means this. In fact, rising from that same cognate is ta'lif. And one of the ways that ta'lif is often used, ta'lif means to form or formation. One of the ways that it's often used is with regards to forming a government or a union. So what is the point of this word ulfa? Think about this again. We have this right that God is saying the greatest of them is the governed towards the governed, the governor towards the governed, and vice versa. And He's made it so that it does what? He's made it nizaman. Nizaman is a system, systematized. What we might call a government. In our language today, the way that we use nizam is often refers to a government. But it doesn't need to be limited to a government. A system that produces ulfa. A system that produces ulfa. What does that mean? A system that produces ulfa is a system that you can rely on. It's predictable. You don't wake up one day and walk outside and say, I can't stand this pain any longer. I am watching my brothers and sisters in Bangladesh suffering, and I need to be in union with them, and I need to support them, and I need to broadcast their voice. And the following day, they're serving a 10-year sentence in prison. That's not friendly. That's not a kind and loving system. That's not a predictable system. It's predictable in the sense that the UAE would uphold tyranny, but it's not the type of predictability that human beings want, because we're talking about a predictability that we need to uphold the rights of people towards their leaders and leaders towards their people. We don't want bad predictability. We want good predictability. We want good reliability, because that is what makes us feel safe. That is what conserves our feeling of being able to adjudicate and to stand for our rights. That is, again, God is using the word fard, the same word that we use for prayer and fasting and hajj. This is an obligation on all people, over all people. This isn't an optional choice. This is what He says. And in a future sermon, maybe I will come back and I will offer you an explanation as to why this is not just Ali's personal opinion. This is rooted deeply, directly in Quranic ethics. So first, in the center, we have this rights, the system of rights that go bilaterally, leader, governor, and governed. If it flows this way, what it will produce is a system of predictability, of accountability, of goodness. And in the other way, وَعَزًّا لِدِينِهِمْ. Professor Qutbuddin says, لِدِينِهِمْ is strengthens Islam. But dinihim could mean, if you're a Christian, Christianity. So perhaps she's right. And it's not that it's wrong. But let's think about systems. Systems that produce this concept of familiarity are grounded in accountability. There is a way to hold the system accountable. There is a way for the people to hold the people who are in charge of the system accountable. There is a way for the system to hold accountable the people who are unruly within their greater society. So what's at the base here is accountability. if you have accountability and it is strengthened, it flows back to the source, this main river here that's flowing. That main current is the governed and the governor and the relationship between them, the equivalence between them. And what that flows back this way, and what does that produce? Necessarily it produces a system of familiarity, a system of friendliness. Your relationship with your government is one that is of mutual regard. So then what happens? فليست تصلح الرعية إلا بصلاح الولاء ولا تصلح الولاء إلا باستقام رعيته. What does this mean? Let's return to the translation, so I don't do it off the top of my head again. So, for subjects will not be righteous, that's the governed. For subjects will not be righteous except when the ruler is righteous. And a ruler will not be righteous except when his subjects are steadfast. إلا باستقامة. So, إلا باستقامة رعيته is how Tahra Qutb says, istiqama is steadfastness. It is. However, one could be steadfastness in evil. You could be steadfast in evil. Sheikh Hasina did 15 years of steadfastness. She was steadfast in working towards improving the economy, but at the price of being steadfast towards forced disappearances, torture, using a drug problem, drug and crime problem in their country to then also, under that guise, disappear political dissidents and quash any dissent. She was steadfast as a ruler. Above all else, she needed to remain in power of Bangladesh because she knew better. Yes, one could be steadfast, but it's not necessarily moral integrity. And that's what I think istiqama is. Maybe that's redundant, moral integrity. Integrity is that. It is a commitment to morality above all else. So here is the linchpin. In order to produce and uphold and feed, it's the rainwater, so to speak. You want this river to flow, you want this river to flow and have enough water for there to be rights that are beneficially, mutually regarded and equal between the governor and the governed, and then for it to spout off and go in one direction, and that direction to strengthen Islam from one, if you want to think of it that way, or to strengthen accountability as I think it is, and in another direction to then necessarily build a system of accountability, a system of ulfa, a governance system that truly cares and is grounded in the pain and the suffering and the need of the average citizen. What you need from that, what is absolutely crucial, the water, the rain, the water that trickles from the mountain or the water that trickles from the glacier. What is it? Istiqama. Istiqama of who? The moral integrity of the citizenry. The moral integrity. Let's think about that and come back to the next sermon. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, astaghfirullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen. Muhammadin al-Mustafa wa ala ahli baytihi tayyibin at-tahirin. وأصحابه القر الميامين. Bismillah. So, we've gone halfway through this khutbah and we've understood a number of things. We've understood this dynamic that God created. One of the greatest or the greatest right and duty that God created between the bilateral relationship between human beings is the right of the governed over the governor, and the right of the governor over the governed, and the duties to each other. And we learned that this system, God created it such that in order for it to function, it must be systematic towards a type of governance that is kind and friendly and genuinely cares and produces safety and reliability. If you don't have that, you're not upholding that right of the dynamic between the equivalent dynamic. And if that's not upheld, it goes the other way and it blocks izzah, it blocks strength of Islam, and it blocks accountability. It inhibits it. This is the function that Ali is offering to us. So let's think about it. Apply it. In your opinion, is Islam strong? Are Muslims strong as Muslims? Do they have izzah? This revolution, this revolution in Bangladesh, it came as a result of what? Islamic ideals? No. That wasn't the source. The source was human rights, secular sciences, and those are good. But nobody thought to go to Islamic ethics. Look at our countries. When someone stands up for what is right, they're thrown in jail for 10 years or even for life. That's not strength in religion. That's not a dignity, a glory for Islam. That's a shame. And that's not accountability. And if you don't have that, you're not upholding the rights. And if you don't uphold those rights between the governed and the governed, then you necessarily will not have a system that produces safety. You have a system that produces fear. Let's see. Let's see what Ali says next and see if this is what he says. He says, if subjects render the ruler his rights, the haqq, the ruler renders them theirs. Both of them give each other their rights. Al-haqq, as he says, al-haqq will become strong. The methods and procedures of accountability, or the manahij-ud-din, will be established. The waymarks of justice will be fixed. And the way of authoritative precedent, or a sunan, will become easy to follow. I've called it authoritative precedent. Thereby, the age will become virtuous, the state can be expected to remain stable, and its enemies' ambitions will be thwarted. But if subjects overpower their ruler, or if the ruler overburdens his subjects, voices will be divided, oppression will rage, corruption of accountability will increase. Rather, Professor Khutbah says that corruption of religious corruption will increase. وَكَثُرَتْ الْأَدْغَالُ فِي الدِّينِ is what it is. And the procedure or the way of the authoritative precedent, mahajj sunan, will be abandoned. Then passions will drive actions, rules will be forsaken, and the hearts will become diseased. People will cease to be outraged even when essential rights are abandoned or great injustices are perpetrated. In that moment, the pious will be shamed and the evil honored, and God will afflict his servants with great punishments. Okay. So Professor Qutb translates "Azz al-haq baynahum" as truth will become strong. I don't disagree. Truth will become strong. If truth is strong, then that means you have accountability. If truth is strong, then that means you have a system that works for the people, that is familiar, that is predictable, that there is a precedent. You don't show up in court one day for a particular crime and then the following day get a horribly terrible different ruling. You don't have the quota system struck down in the lower courts, but then when it goes to the Supreme Court, have those who are in power who need to uphold nepotism call the Supreme Court and say, how did you get on the Supreme Court to begin with? You got into the Supreme Court because of these quotas. And we're telling you, reinstate the quota. That is not a system of predictability. That is not a system based on judicial precedent. That is not accountability. So, the truth will become strong, in general is correct. But we're talking about al-haq, a particular haq, not the truth with the big R or the big T or the big R reality. We're talking about the haq that this sermon is about. What is that haq again? The haq that this sermon is about, the great a'zamu haq, is what he's saying. This haq is the haq of the bilateral equivalence between the equivalent reality of the leader and the governed. That is the haq that is being talked about here. وَعَزَّ الْحَقْ بَيْنَهُمْ. So, this particular haq is what makes the government reliable and what makes us accountable to each other. So, what do we observe? Establishment of procedural accountability, reliability on just outcomes, and familiarity and predictability via observing a just precedent is what we're looking at. So Ali describes this reality very similarly to what we did before, safety and stability. And another thing now about sunan. I'm not necessarily convinced that the sunan is referring to the way that we understand the prophetic sunnah in our modern conception. But I also don't believe that it's wrong if we understand the sunnah or the sunan that Ali is referring to in this other way, in this way of the sunnah is precedent. The sunnah is precedent. And it's authoritative. You don't want to set a bad precedent. That's something that you hear all the time. Don't set a bad precedent. Why? Because it has a level of authority. Because somebody will come back and say, well, I can't depend on you. Last time you said this. Last time you came with this ruling. Last time this is how you did it. So why did you change it up all of a sudden? Yes, because this is a corruption. That is a corruption of those rights and the way that the system is supposed to work. It is a corruption of the nizam. So the sunan, in my opinion, is that authoritative precedent. That's why it's so important. It's part of the right that the governed have over the governor. Your authoritative precedent has to be reliable and has to enact safety and has to enact predictability. We have to be able to follow your logic. It can't just wave in the wind whenever you feel like it. You can't just try to build a political elite to continue to keep yourself in power like Sheikh Hasina was doing. That is the ultimate reality of that 30% quota. Because you have a whole generation or generations of people that say, Sheikh Hasina, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have this position. So when she calls in for a favor, what happens? You oblige, and the system is corrupted. What then happens to the obligation, the greatest obligation that God has mandated upon you? You've destroyed it, and you've destroyed all sense of accountability. You've weakened accountability. طيب. كثرت الأدغال في الدين. She says religious corruption will increase. No, I mean, it will. But also accountability will decrease. The proper accountability would decrease. As we continue, Professor Qutbuddin referred to as sunan. Sunan is mentioned twice. Later it is mentioned again. Later it is mentioned again because here it says, وَكَثْرَتْ أَدْغَالَ فِي الدِّينِ وَتُرِكَتْ مَحَاجَ السُّنَنِ. وَتُرِكَتْ مَحَاجَ السُّنَنِ. She understood this as religious corruption increases, that the procedure, as religious corruption increases, that the straight road will be abandoned. So one time she understands sunan to mean sunnah, right, the prophetic precedent or the prophetic tradition. And then a few sentences later, for her, a sunan came to mean something else, the straight road. But the straight road, we typically say sirat al-mustaqim. So when I looked in the original Arabic, I was expecting to see sirat al-mustaqim. But it wasn't there. It was mahaj al-sunan. Mahaj al-sunan is far closer in this conception, in this coherent sermon, to the idea of a procedure, a reliable procedure, an authoritative precedent, following a way. That's how you follow a way. That is what even prophetic precedent is. Ultimately, you do something because the Prophet did it, and he is the authority. But here, you can do it because you can follow the logic. So, what does that mean? Following the authority of precedent should give a society a feeling of comfort and safety. Setting a bad precedent is not conducive to building a reliable system that produces fair and predictable outcomes. So we come to the very end of Ali's sermon. What to do now? He's told us how to do things the right way, and he's told us when things go wrong, why they do. And we go back to the question of our friend who is a civil service candidate and wonders, what should I do to help my people? And what should I do to please God? Here's what Ali says. O people, counsel one another in this matter and help one another as you should. No one, no matter how strong his wish to secure God's pleasure or how far-reaching his efforts in doing good, is capable of rendering to God the obedience that is truly due. Here's the really important part. Again, God has mandated as a right for himself, this is a different right. God has mandated as a right for himself over his servants that they counsel one another as much as they are able and help one another in establishing in what is proper. No man, no matter how great his station in truth or how superior his precedence in religion, is above needing help in establishing God's charge. And no man, no matter how servile people might think him, or how humble he may appear to their eyes, is too lowly to help in this or to be helped. Let's restate that. What does that mean? God has made another fard. He's made another mandate, an obligation over his ibad, over his servants, that they give nasiha to one another. Nasiha in the proper, true sense. What is nasiha supposed to accomplish? In our modern terms, we think it on very petty things like clothing or how to sound or etiquette type things. And then they get all upset when you tell them we have much bigger problems to think about. Well, what is Ali saying? Is he talking about etiquette? No. He's talking about this greatest of rights between human beings. You think you've done someone a favor by telling them to wear pants or shorts. Ali is inspiring you to think about the greatest of rights between you is maintaining this level of equivalency between your systems of government and your governed. And if it is not equal, that is a usurpation of God's sovereignty. And you cannot do that. If you do that, you take God's position. And if you take God's position, you necessarily will destroy and corrupt all of the systems around you. And it will end in famine and disease and war and all kinds of horrific stuff. That is what happens. And that's why it's the greatest right. He says the greatest right bilaterally between human beings. Think of all of the relationships that human beings have with each other. Brothers and sisters, parents and children, orphans and their caretakers, prophets to their congregants, to the people that they are warning. There's hundreds of examples. And Ali says the greatest of them is the dynamic between the governed and the governor. Think about that. Pray on that. This is a massive responsibility. And it seems to suggest that we cannot make progress unless we make this our front and center of the way we think, of what we act, of what we do. Everything needs to be inclined towards setting the scale right in our systems. And the way we do that is by making sure that our homes are also that way. Be very careful if you're in a position of leadership. My nasiha to you, dear sister, my nasiha to you, and I hope that Dr. Abdul Fadl would agree with me. Take your position in civil service, especially now in this interim government. Take your position in civil service and show the people that you together can build a system of accountability and familiarity, loving and kind. Not the type of bureaucracy that I've seen in my home country when you walk in and you say, I'm a citizen of this country and you're the government. Can you please give me a stamp so I can leave on time? Can I renew my passport? It's like pulling teeth. And that's the silliest example you can think of. We are not serving each other right. So go into civil service and serve. And if you serve this right, you serve Allah. You wish to attain God's pleasure. You wish to be a real razakar, not the pejorative. A real razakar, a real volunteer for God's sake. Then go into civil service and create a system that can be relied upon, that wouldn't be afraid to stand up to the tyrant, because Bangladesh is not out of the woods yet. This is an interim government. You have to be very careful about what comes next. You have to keep the military at bay so it doesn't become a military dictatorship. You have to be very careful of other political parties jumping in and trying to take advantage of the vacuum. The students should be relied on and should be celebrated. The moral steadfast, the ones with moral integrity amongst you, must be elevated and must be celebrated. You must properly mourn the lives that were lost in this horrific tyranny. And the rest of us must appeal for these poor souls in the United Arab Emirates to be released. If you work in the civil service, I hope that you can find a way to help them. No man, no matter how great his station to truth, or how superior his presence in religion, is above needing help in establishing God's charge. And no man, no matter how servile the people may think him, or how humble he may appear to their eyes, is too lowly to help in this or to be helped. This is total equality, absolute equality, absolute equality. Ya ibadullah, I enjoin you to morality, to integrity. Think and realize and ponder this sermon, how the source, the water, the very water, the life force of our rights begins with our morality and our conviction that morality is our charge. And then we can uphold our rights, and then we can discharge our duties simultaneously in an equal and fair fashion. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عن سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة إنك لا تخلف الميعاد. Ya Rabbi, I ask you to please bless the souls and place your mercy upon the martyrs of all those who gave their lives in the revolution, the second revolution in Bangladesh. Help these people. This is 170 million people. Help us Muslims to support them in whatever way we can. And bless them as they move forward to try to deliver your charge and to discharge their duty and their obligation towards this great right, this greatest of rights that you have enjoined and mandated upon us. Bless the souls of the shuhada all across the world. وصلي وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين وأقم الصلاة.